Well, when I was a little boy and attending Jewish school, the big news when I was the ripe old age of 7 was that Israel and Egypt signed a peace treaty, and everyone was quite excited. I remember that even as a child. And Jordan signed a peace treaty, but as the years went by, I could tell it was a cold peace. And of course, the Palestinian issue took center stage. And despite massive attempts at a peace process, there was more process than peace. Israel offered so much. In the end, it was rejected by the PLO. And even the peace treaty with Egypt, well, it wasn't peace for peace. It was peace for Israel giving back the massive Sinai desert and all of its assets, which is why I've been a skeptic of Middle East peace, because as Golda Meir said, we won't have peace until Arab leaders love their own children as much as they hate Israel. That was her way of saying it's in their interest to want peace, not war. Well, it finally happened, and I can't even believe it. And 40 years of my thinking has been turned upside down. I saw this tweet, this photograph. Let me read it. The moment Jared Kushner gave His Majesty King Hamad bin Isa bin Salman Al Khalifa of the Kingdom of Bahrain a Torah scroll for a synagogue in Bahrain, and you can see Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law and advisor on various things, including the Middle East, giving a Jewish Torah to the King of Bahrain, who not only accepted it, but consented to this photo being published. This is the opposite of the cold peace with Egypt and Jordan, and the false peace with the PLO that's always broken. This was peace for peace, and not just that. A Muslim leader of a Muslim country accepting a symbol of Judaism. It's not a grudging peace. This changes everything I've thought. This coming on the heels of Israel's deal with the United Arab Emirates, and Oman seems next to go, perhaps Saudi Arabia itself. I am shocked by these things, and I have to say that that photo itself is a proof that this might actually be a warm peace, a true peace. I can't even believe it. I don't want to be naive, but I think it's happening. Joining us now via Skype from Los Angeles is our friend Joel Pollak, senior editor-at-large at Breitbart.com, a great American patriot, but also someone who, like me, cares about Israel. What do you think of that photograph, Joel?
Well, it's very interesting. One of the things that Jared Kushner has done in arranging these agreements is to couch them in the shared monotheism of the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish worlds. And that's why they called these peace agreements the Abraham Accords. Bahrain has a small Jewish community. They have a synagogue. And several months ago, there were religious services in the synagogue. They also, about a decade ago, had an ambassador, a diplomat, I believe to the United States, who was a Jewish woman who lived in Bahrain. Now, it's a very small country, and it's not a very sizable Jewish community, but they've shown an openness to the presence of that community before. So that was an interesting exchange. The UAE doesn't have a synagogue yet. They have some kind of religious faith center where I think services can be held. But the idea was to couch this all in a shared religious tradition, even though these three religions have much that divides them, and certainly even within these divisions, you have divisions among Sunni and Shia and so forth. There are many divisions, but the idea was to couch this all in a kind of spirit of cooperation. And I think that was a very effective way, at least of framing these agreements and explaining their significance to the broader world, particularly to Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East and beyond, who might initially be skeptical of normalization with Israel. This does create at least some kind of framework where this becomes understandable beyond the national interests and economic interests of the countries involved.
Well, what strikes me as so different here is we know that Israel has always had secret and private communications and even deals with countries. They have common enemies, Iran, for example. They would share intelligence on the down low. But the public messaging for public consumption in the Muslim world, the Arab world, was always hostile, even anti-Semitic. Even in Egypt, they would run a massive TV series on the anti-Semitic forgery, about Jews poisoning wells or Jews making matzah with the blood of Gentiles, like extreme protocols of the elders of Zion anti-Semitism. Like that was standard fare for the Arab street by these dictators. This looks warm. I see on Twitter Muslim religious leaders in the UAE fighting against people who would try and come between them and Israel and saying, I would stand with a Jew before I stand with you. Like it's so, it may be political, but it's so public and they're embracing it for good and for bad. This is something I have never seen in my entire life.
It's amazing, isn't it? Well, first of all, there's a very strong interest in the UAE in developing ties with Israel and vice versa. Israel is a technology hub, it's a financial hub, it's a center of innovation, and it's a center of investment. So for the UAE to gain access to Tel Aviv really means gaining access to the West in a broader sense. Dubai has always been, or not always, I should say, for the last 10 to 20 years has been a commercial center and has developed its own economy separate from the energy industry, which has been very important. But they really want to partner and cooperate with Israel in a deeper sense. And they understand that working with Israel is a bridge to the West in Silicon Valley, the West in Wall Street. These are avenues that were to some degree open, but not fully open. For Israel, it's gaining a whole new set of partners through Dubai, not just in the Middle East, but keeping in mind that Dubai is a place where a lot of African companies and workers go to invest, to do business, to shop. Likewise with Asia, Israelis can now fly directly through Dubai when they want to go to Thailand, when they want to go backpacking in Kathmandu or whatever it is. But Israel now has a more direct connection to the Far East. So this is really an incredible partnership, and I think we'll see it develop over the next 10 years. This Tel Aviv-Dubai partnership, it's technically a Jerusalem-Abu Dhabi partnership. And when I was on Al Jazeera earlier today, that's how they referred to it. They referred to it as Tel Aviv Abu Dhabi, Abu Dhabi being the capital of the UAE and Tel Aviv being the only capital they'll recognize in Israel at the moment. But it really is a Tel Aviv-Dubai partnership. It's the economy of Tel Aviv and the economy of Dubai that are going to create this massive prosperity that the entire region and the world really are going to benefit from. And so I think that there's a forward-thinking leadership that's been quiet for a long time in the Muslim world, but is responding to calls like President Sisi in Egypt, who gave a speech in the Al-Azhar Mosque a few years ago, calling on Muslims to turn against radicalism and saying that terrorism was anti-Islamic, and saying it from, I believe, one of the oldest existing mosques in the Islamic world. And there is and has been this undercurrent of different thinking that's been overshadowed by Al-Qaeda, overshadowed by ISIS, overshadowed by Iran. And now suddenly the forces for progress in the non-political sense, just the general sense of development and prosperity, I mean, they're having a moment in the sun, and maybe it can be extended indefinitely if it works out.
Hey, let me read you a couple of tweets from Andrew Neil, who I regard as the leading journalist in the United Kingdom. He's a great Scot, and he's the publisher of The Spectator. He said something that I hadn't heard of before. I didn't think of it before because I'm coming from my point of view, a Canadian, a Westerner, a conservative, a Jew, etc. But listen to what he said about how Muslims are embracing this. I had never heard this before. Here's what Andrew Neil said. He said, an Abu Dhabi's official national newspaper, so he's quoting from their paper, the UAE-Israel Accord is a win for every Muslim. Get this. Since 9/11, Muslims across the world have been on the defensive. I saw the suspicion of Muslims in the eyes of American officials. It always boiled down to, show us peace in Islam. Now, with visionary accord between UAE and Israel, a new horizon is opening up to reinstate Muslim dignity by showing peace between peoples. We can now say a new way of coexistence is achievable. We are not pawns for the mullahs of Iran or the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's about Muslims saying, you said you wanted peace. We've made peace. Don't look at us as the enemy now. Accept us as you would accept Italians or the Spanish or the Germans we are part of this world, this Abrahamic community. I never looked at it that way, but it is so true. And I do look at Muslims and Arabs in the UAE and Bahrain and Oman differently now. I truly do. You can't pose with Jared Kushner taking a Jewish Torah for a synagogue without making people say, you know what, this guy might actually believe in peace. I'm touched by it.
Yeah, I think that feeling is going to be quite widespread, and I think that that's the end of the bargain that the West has to fulfill, that Israel has to fulfill, the United States has to fulfill. This ought to change perceptions of the Muslim world, provided it continues, provided it can keep rolling on, because it's obviously still a work in progress. And the one holdout, of course, is the Palestinian Authority. They condemned these peace agreements, and so did Iran. And there are still elements in the Muslim world, of course, that are rejecting this kind of move. But you're right. It does change your perspective, I think, of the Islamic world if you understand there isn't some lingering hatred that it's harboring for some part of the West, or for all of the West, but even for just some part of the West, like Israel. As long as that issue remains, it's very hard to develop a full and authentic kind of understanding. But once you see these leaders embracing one another and looking toward the future, I do think everything is possible. And it's very exciting.
That's an excerpt from my daily show, the Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.